Did Rachel say she's gonna come later today, or like
She might never come.
No.
Yeah. She better come for government.
Ooh, you're right. Game over. Ooh.
Okay, we're going to continue with looking at International Gothic. We're going to focus entirely on England today. There was a lot that was going on with Gothic in England. It was actually funny. I was looking through my classes from 4 years ago and then 2 years ago when I did the same one and didn't touch English Gothic at all. And I was like,
Do you change it every day?
no, I usually just update it based on where we are, but it's 90% of it's done. But didn't talk anything about England last time.
So how did you make that all? Like, how long did it take you to make all this?
So one class, start to finish, is about 2 hours
Oh my.
for notes and slideshow.
Okay.
So
That's like.
yeah,
So when
100 hours.
you first started teaching,
every class was about 2 hours.
but that was like the first year of HFA.
Yeah, but now I take it and
Yeah.
and so I'll add some things and I'll look back at my notes and go, yeah, I need to add this, I need to delete this. So
Did you
nowadays
all
it takes
at
like
once?
30 minutes. No,
Or did,
no,
I
just
know.
right before each class,
oh,
or like the day before, or the week before, or something.
yeah.
So
Did you used to teach like 2 classes a day? Or no?
the first year I taught art history and then CSP because I wasn't teaching theology at all.
Did you teach it every day? Did you taught CSP every day and art history every day? Or no? Was
I
that
think
just-
3 times a week because the first year I was only doing, first 2 years I was only doing art history 3 times a week or 2 times a week or something like that. And then it was study hall the other, kind of like what you guys do with government. So, yeah.
Oh.
Because Mr. A was teaching religion the first year,
Oh.
And then grandpa.
Oh, then Miss.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Grandpa.
So then when we came here,
Okay,
So-
Apostles Creek.
3rd year,
Dude, I
yeah.
tripped on
That
that
was
one.
so bad. I still have traumatic memories about doing
What?
I tripped
We had to
on
write
I remember
Apostles Creed, and I did not know how to do
Maria
that.
was writing and I was like,
I was probably like, that was bad.
I hate when they do
Natalia, you asked about Goth versus Gothic. So looked it up because I didn't know. The term Goth, like the lifestyle, the music, all that kind of stuff, it actually comes from Gothic literature, not Gothic art. So Gothic literature has no correlation with Gothic art. Gothic literature is like Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, all those guys.
Wait, I know
Yeah.
her.
So that's Gothic literature. That's a totally different time period than Gothic art and architecture. Why did Gothic literature call it itself? I don't know that. I didn't dive deep enough into that.
Because Edgar Allan Poe wasn't around this time, was he?
No. That was like
Goth.
1800s, right?
Yeah.
I think. Mary Shelley at least was 1800s.
Yeah, she was born in 1780.
So okay, 1700s, 1800s. So Goth. It started with music. It started with punk. And there was one reviewer who was like, they're channeling the Gothic literature style, that kind of dark, broody, and that's how it started with music. Then it turned into lifestyle, dress,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. So interesting. I didn't know that either.
Fascinating.
Cool
Yep.
beans.
Okay, so with I need to turn on my slideshow. So with English Gothic architecture, there are some distinct differences. There's a lot of similarities. But we need to look at our timeline, our handy-dandy timeline that we've been looking at already. So again, we're in Gothic. Oh, you like pink? We got more pink because let's compare English Gothic to regular Gothic. So
I love the teal. We
Thank
got
you.
more teal. Where's the teal?
teal.
Why is there so much white?
Yeah, you gotta like,
It's kind of
you
boring.
gotta darken it.
Yeah, okay.
Racist.
2 years from now, I'll do that. Morning, Max. Okay, so let's look at,
On your bucket list.
let's compare contrast regular Gothic to English Gothic. You can see it's roughly around the same time period. Early Gothic, when we look at Saint-Denis, we look at Ile-de-France. That started about 1120. English Gothic started a little bit later, 1180. And what's interesting is that English Gothic is going to stay kind of static. It's going to be the main architectural style in England. It's going to go later than most other places starting to develop Renaissance, especially in Florence, especially in Italy. Italy and Florence in particular is going to kind of break from the Gothic tradition pretty quickly, a lot more quickly than Germany and France down here. They're going to move to the Renaissance by the 1430s, so way before the 1500s. But England's going to continue all the way up into the 1520s. And they're going to kind of, later on, throughout the 1500s, 1600s. They're going to take the Gothic and just kind of develop it further. It's going to turn into a different style. Tudor style, right? That's around the time of Henry VIII. So Tudor style, Elizabethan style is going to come in, but it's going to set a lot of characteristics for what we're going to be seeing as English architecture throughout time. Okay, so what are some characteristics and differences? England loved what was happening. If you can think about a map, I want to get maps one of these days. If you think about a map, right, the top half of France, we have where Normandy is, right at the very top of France, where D-Day happened, and that was really close to England. So there's a lot of cross-pollination between what's happening in France and England at this time, right? The Edward the Confessor, I think, Edward the Conqueror? William the Conqueror, he was French, he was Norman. Norman is French, right? And so there was this invasion, they invaded the Anglo-Saxons, and that's basically, France essentially took over England, but then it turned into its own country. So we have a lot of cross-pollination in the 1100s, and when was that invasion? That was like in the 11th century, right, in the 1000s. So a lot of the same characteristics of the Gothic style, but they're going to adopt it to their own regional preferences. The main big difference that we're going to see is that whereas French, German cathedrals, not so much Italian, but French and German Gothic cathedrals are going to be really focused on verticality, really tall structures. English Gothic is going to have a lot of the same decoration, a lot of the same characteristics, but it's going to be more broad. Generally speaking, we're going to have there's more of an emphasis on horizontal depth, length, width. It's a lot more symmetrical. It's not as tall. Generally speaking, there are going to be some cathedrals that are going to be taller, but yeah.
So did this start as Catholic and now it's Anglican?
Correct.
It's cool. There's the 12 apostles.
Look at the grass.
Yep.
is luscious.
There's 12 of them.
Where?
The figures. What do I count next?
Oh.
I was counting up more, but I don't know. Yeah, that works.
Yep. Oh yeah, there too.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yep.
I don't get it.
I don't know. I can't see.
Yeah.
How do they do that?
Okay, so less verticality. French Gothic cathedrals built to be increasingly tall. English Gothic cathedrals tended to emphasize the length of the building rather than the height. Right, we're going to be looking at some of these as we go throughout. Now, it doesn't mean
Why is it
What's that thing in the back?
a little mossy?
that's a Protestant church in the back. So
what is that?
it's another Protestant church in the back.
It's like glass.
Yeah.
Like the light up.
So it doesn't mean that it's not tall. It just means that the proportions are not as narrow, right? Narrow versus tall.
At least they both look the same.
Oh.
This is
There is so nice.
Salisbury Cathedral. We'll see. We're going to look at Salisbury Cathedral in more detail. This is this is where it comes from. Yep, from the town of Salisbury. This does have a pretty large tower, pretty tall tower. We're not going to see this as much. We're going to see some towers, but just not quite as much as we've seen in France. But even still, even without the tower, right? This is much more spread out. There's actually going to be a double transept. We'll see that in a little bit.
Whoa.
So most of the largest and best works of English architecture, especially the medieval cathedrals of England, were largely built in the Gothic style. But it wasn't just big cathedrals that were built this way. This style is going to kind of flow into a lot of other buildings as well. We have castles, palaces, great houses, universities, parish churches, and really small, unpretentious buildings. This is called the Vicar's Close. This is right next to Wells Cathedral that we're going to see. So this is like a little town, a little subdivision, but this is built in the Gothic style. Even though it doesn't, how do we know it's built in the Gothic style? Boop, boop, boop. Right, you can see that. Okay, those pointy arches. Here's a college, Merton College, one of the oldest colleges in England. It's very cloudy, very rainy. The grass is very fine, right? It's like what you would see in the north of the United States. Really, really nice grass. Rainy England, cloudy England, you hear that all the time. They don't get a lot of sun. Perfect for growing. Yes, and bad teeth.
Yes, I've realized.
This is called the School of Pythagoras. This is the oldest building in Cambridge. This was started in about 1200. It wasn't actually ever a school. This is a private house. We don't know where it got the name School of Pythagoras from. But again, this is just a private house, but it's built in the Gothic style. Okay? All right, so those are kind of the characteristics. That's kind of what is going on in England with architecture at the time.
Doesn't grass grow better with sun though?
Gosh, the grass is
Some of the
so
UV is
nice.
still coming through, though.
Jealous.
But, the brick on the house, is that a design or is that the actual brick they used? Because that's ridiculous.
That's the actual brick they used.
I
What?
love that brick.
That's the actual brick they used.
How the heck do they? They're like big. It's like river rock.
Yeah. All right, so what are some characteristics of early English Gothic? Let me go back real quick. We're going to be divided into 3 different sub-periods. We have the early, we have the decorated, and the perpendicular. Dates are on your handout as well, but we're going to start with early English Gothic. What are characteristics of the early English Gothic? And each of these characteristics are really going to kind of flow into the next, right? It's a continuous development, but this is the time period where, all right, these things are introduced, and then we're going to carry them on into the next couple periods of English Gothic architecture. And like I said before, a lot of these same characteristics are going to go on into Tudor style and Elizabethan style later on, which we'll talk about a little bit later. First feature we want to talk about is lancet windows. We've seen windows that look like this before, and here I'm talking about these tall ones with the pointy arches. We've seen windows like this before. We've seen archways like this before in France, but what England is going to do is really, it's funny, even though the building itself is much more horizontal, the windows are going to get thinner and taller, right? Really thin, really tall. These are called lancet windows. It comes from the term lance, like a spear, right? So it's tall or it's long and narrow and has a pointy end like a lance. Mm-hmm.
What if it's like wider, but it's still super
They're
long?
like
Would that be a lancet window?
It would still be a lancet window. So most of the windows we see in English Gothic architecture we call a lancet window.
You just call it regular windows that were just almost box within the box shape, but they had the.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it probably depends on what art historian you're talking to, right? They may call it a lancet window. Technically, any window that has a pointed arch is a lancet window. But when we say it, this is kind of what we're referring to. And it really starts to develop here at the English Gothic in the early period. And again, not just in cathedrals, right? We have lancet windows in all sorts of other places too, okay? The next thing we're going to be looking at, and again, this isn't just an English invention. They were doing it in France too, but England is going to take it and really develop it further. Again, this is just a smaller parish church, but it's a great example of the early English Gothic. We have what's called tracery. Tracery. So tracery is the stone, the thin stone. Thank you, that word. Dividers that are between a window. They're usually very thin, almost kind of feather-like looking. Earlier Romanesque churches didn't have that, right? There were big pillars between each window and then a smaller window in between. Now they're figuring out, hey, we can kind of use this, even though the stone is thin, we can use it as supports. And this helps to support this arch that's still up there, right?
Would it be like a stain? Is it more for the glass or is it for the art? I mean, for the brick?
So early on, this is a little bit of a later version that's more decorative, so that's going to be in the decorative style, but it's a good example of that. So early on, it's just going to be purely geometric, and then later on, it's going to become more decorative. Okay.
That's cool.
Quick side note: this little thing, this is just an outcropping. Anyone know what this is for?
Rain.
Yeah, it's just to keep rain from going down into the window,
Why I said it a second.
right? They didn't have.
Clock behind it.
But what if it's going this way?
That's
Or is
true.
it going that way?
Again, they didn't have silicone caulk, right? They didn't have that kind of stuff. So you either fit it in really perfectly, or you have rain coming in. So what do? They put this cowling over it
Does that actually help?
yeah. And so any of the rain that's coming down is just going to divert around it.
Do you think it's windy?
Yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but it'll help. So you can see that over all the windows. You're not going to see that on every single window, but
Was that a cemetery in front of the church?
uh-huh.
Why would they
Again,
do that?
very common because you're baptized there, you're married there, your sacraments are there, you're buried there, right? This was your home,
That's kind of dope.
right? It's pretty common, right? Most churches that are built are purpose-built with a cemetery right next to it. That new big church that's being built in Kansas is being built right next to the existing cemetery that's there, right? It's kind of a...
Cemetery next to a church.
Mm-hmm. It's a memento mori, right? It's a reminder of your final end. You walk past the headstones to go into and pray for your salvation and pray for your, satisfaction for your sins, right? It's a very, very Catholic thing. Again, a little bit of cross-pollination from England or from Ireland coming in here as well with some of these headstones. Side note, we have a general, and I say a general lack of rose windows. We're going to see some, but we're not going to see nearly as many as we saw in France and in Germany. So examples of some cathedrals without rose windows, right? Again, this is a priory. This is a smaller
How's it
parish church. I'm sorry?
How's a cathedral? It is smaller.
It's not. It's a priory. It's just a parish. It's a parish church.
Oh.
Okay. And even in the bigger ones, we do have a rose window here, but again, it's not as prominent, not as big. Most of the other windows that we're going to see are just these. So again, maybe 20%, 30% have rose windows. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but they're just not as common. Okay. So those are the features, right? So you have that main characteristic in bold point there, and then features in bold points. Again, that's a hint. Things bold, things underlined. You want to know. All right. So let's look at Canterbury Cathedral. We're going to look at 3 cathedrals that were part of this early Gothic period.
If you go back, like, why is there gray? Just because it's molding? No, back there.
That's copper. So it started to get that patina. Same sort of thing, yep. All right, Canterbury Cathedral. This is the cathedral.
Have you ever been to England for that?
I have not. I'd love to go
I
someday.
want to go to England.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Bucket list.
Yeah.
Oh, bucket list.
So this is one of the more important churches in England. Some stuff you do before you kick the bucket.
Oh, cool.
So this is one of the more important churches in England, and it became more important after the Reformation, because this is the cathedral see. This is the cathedral seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anyone know what the Archbishop of Canterbury is today?
Oh,
Who is he? What does he do? Why is he important?
The Catholic one or the Anglican one?
Anglican one. Archbishop of Canterbury is,
He gets to sit in the throne.
he's essentially the head of the Church of England, underneath the monarch.
You want it.
Right? No, sorry. So that's why this is important. It was an important cathedral beforehand as well, but it has more importance after the Reformation for the Anglicans than it did for the Catholics. This is an old church, built in 597 originally, but it was completely rebuilt between 1070 and 1077. But then, again, it was rebuilt in 1174. One guess as to why it had to be completely rebuilt in 1174? Fire. Right?
Bombs.
Right, a fire. So a fire destroyed most of that second original church. So we had kind of a very basic church built in the 500s, another one built in the 1000s, again, very Romanesque style. We have just a few drawings of it, but it was rebuilt again in 1174. It was then that it was largely rebuilt in the Gothic style. We have significant eastward expansions. So the front of it was starting to be built, the nave was starting to be built, but then they continued to build it off to the east. Why? Because there was a relic there. So who was killed, if you haven't looked at your notes yet, who was killed in Canterbury Cathedral? Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket. St. Thomas Becket was killed in Canterbury Cathedral, right? Why? He had a conflict with the king. King didn't like him, and the king was like, he gave this impassioned speech in front of his soldiers, and he said, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" He was speaking rhetorically. His soldiers took it as a command and went into the chapel, went into the church, went into Canterbury Cathedral here, while Thomas Becket was preparing for Mass and starting to say Mass, and killed him, and killed him basically on the altar.
It kind of sounds like pleased with that, or was he just?
Was the king pleased?
Was that
Originally, yes. He was like, "Ooh, yeah, he's gone." But then, shortly afterwards, he repented and went to beg forgiveness at the tomb of Thomas Becket later on. So we have hope for his salvation.
Was he, like, as in rhetorical, was he just kind of basically saying, like,
Who's going to get rid of this guy for me?
Well, that's not his fault then.
Because they had this argument. Well, right, but as a king, you can't do that, right?
Yeah, especially in the altar, you're not supposed to, you can't.
The soldiers were absolutely with pure fault and malice for doing that, right? You cannot do that.
Because he didn't command them, he was just making a.
He was making a
Wait,
statement.
somebody got killed. He got killed here.
He got killed in the church. So this is the interior of it. This is kind of your transition period.
Did they have him working in the church before he got killed?
Yeah, I'll show you.
It was like Parliament.
They have a, this is a really good, again, art historians love these kind of transitional churches, these transitional buildings or artworks, where you can see characteristics of Romanesque, right? See characteristics of Romanesque, these really large, solid piers and columns. But again, then you have this Gothic style that's starting to come in about. If you look at the arches, except for these here, but these arches over here, they're not super tall and pointy. They're more Romanesque. They do have a point, but again, it's kind of this transitional style. You see this really really thick piers. And again, this chevron pattern. If we go back to Durham Cathedral, right? Durham Cathedral with all those chevron patterns, those huge piers. I showed you the video, and it was the lady and the man who were talking like this. We see these chevron, right? I remember watching that video. Very similar, right? This is that transitional period between Romanesque and early Gothic. This is the,
That's a clone cathedral.
yeah. So this is the, so how did Gothic come into England? It was a lot of traveling Norman stonemasons. They had been working in France, and they were looking for work. And they came up to England, and this fire happened, and they said, hey, there's a fire. Let's go, let's travel. Because, right, I mentioned this before. Once a stonemason, once the workers are done with building a church, they got to look for more work. So they hear through the grapevine that there's this church that was destroyed by fire. They're going to come up with their knowledge of Gothic architecture, and they're going to say, hey, there's this new way of doing it. Cool. That's how it kind of migrates into England.
Can you imagine a picture of the cathedral?
Yeah.
How is it like? That's like specifically designed for like an Anglican church, isn't it?
No, actually, these are choir stalls. These are choir stalls for monks and clerics to say the divine office behind us. So they will all sit here during Mass, and then there's the screen. The faithful will go back there. So they still have that rood screen there.
But can the faithful see the?
Not very well. Now there is a space between. They've taken out some of the choir stalls at the very front. No, this is right in the apse. This is the tomb of St. Thomas Becket. So he's still there.
Oh, that's the tomb right there.
Yeah.
That's not the altar.
That's a small altar over the tomb of Thomas
That's
Becket.
exactly where he got killed.
No, it's not.
Wait, so it's
So-
like the shrine?
Yeah, it's a relic chapel essentially. We're going to come back to this. These are the cloisters. This was built a little bit later on. These are the cloisters that were built a little bit later on. This is actually in a totally different style, so we're going to take a look at that a little bit later on. And again, like I mentioned, not a lot of rose windows. What we are going to see, especially in the decorative period, again, a lot of this was built a little bit later. This was built in stages, so we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But the decorative style is going to have these really large plate glass windows. Okay, Wells Cathedral Church of St. Andrew. Haha, it's my favorite. Okay, I'm biased. Again, we see the horizontal lines. We see the lack of verticality. We see this almost boxy shape of the towers. Again, there's still spires, there's still towers, but it's not as super vertical. I think you can. What's that?
No, we already looked at this one.
Why build access?
Yeah, I showed you this briefly.
Yeah, you showed us one.
Why build access points on there?
Why did they?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
The towers.
I don't know.
Cool.
Maybe the Muslim call to prayer? I couldn't tell you.
Ultimate airsoft.
Yeah.
Cool.
Unlike Canterbury, this is purely Gothic, right? So Canterbury was this transition between Romanesque and Gothic. Wells is purely Gothic. Building began right around the same time, 1175, at the east end of the choir. But by this point, we have maybe different stonemasons, different architects who are going to come in and say, no, let's purely do this in Gothic. It's been called Europe's first truly Gothic structure, breaking the last constraints of Romanesque. I think that's a pretty large claim to make. I wouldn't agree with that, but that's what the English will say. No, we actually came up with Gothic first. Yeah, it was French people. Europe's first, right? And I would disagree with that. I don't think that's accurate. But again, the English are very proud of the Gothic style. They're going to say, well, we perfected it. The French may have started it. We perfected it. But there's a little bit of bias there. Decoration of the exterior. So this is the interior. We see the same characteristics that we've been seeing in France. We have this tri-part interior, right? We have the nave. We have this arcade here in the middle, and then we have the clerestory. All right, to bring in the light from the above. And again, the roof, right? If we're kind of looking through this, the roof over the aisle there is going to be going that way. So then you have the clerestory to let light in. Otherwise, it's going to be super dark. But a lot of the same characteristics with those columns, those piered columns. And again, we start to really see this thinning of the windows and the arches. The exterior, we're going to see a lot of figures, very reminiscent of the French Gothic. Lots of statues here that are gone. Statues here that are without their heads. English Reformation, right? We have a lot of Protestants who are going to come in and say, let's get rid of these Catholic saints. Let's get rid of these Papist saints. And so they tore them down. They knocked the heads off.
And kept the ones
But up here, they couldn't really reach them very well, so they were left. And as we move up to the top, we see the statues are still there. Some of the same, again, characteristics of French Gothic. These long, elongated figures. Again, this is still pretty early on. They haven't taken on that more human style, that more human looking. And again, we'll notice here, each of these are buttresses, right? So this is a buttress, right? And moving forward, not a flying buttress. Remember, a buttress is just an extra piece, an extra support on the exterior. This cathedral doesn't have flying buttresses. Others in England will, but this one in particular doesn't. But they don't need the flying buttresses generally, because they're generally not building as tall and thin. It's more wide, so they don't need that extra horizontal support that's coming in. We're going to see some flying buttresses, but not a ton. Not as many as France and Germany. Yeah?
So would they, were to like do the statues, would they just place them after they were done, or they would do them like right there?
They do them on the ground and hoist them up, and then attach them in. Yeah, so it's not all carved from one
They
piece.
just took a huge brick and then carved up.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Salisbury Cathedral, probably one of the more important.
last year, that painting.
Yeah, this is Constable. This is Constable's painting of Salisbury Cathedral.
That's really pretty.
So this is a painting from the 1800s, but
The towers.
Salisbury Cathedral was built between 1220 and 1258. It's one of the best examples of early English Gothic architecture as well. Again, we still have that horizontal lines. We still have those lancet windows all throughout. We have no rose window. Actually, there might be one rose window, but broadly speaking, we don't have the rose window, but we do have this massive spire. That's a little bit strange for an English Gothic cathedral. They just didn't have that as much. The thing about the spire, though, it's made out of wood, so it's able to get very tall. It's light. So this whole part here, it's not clad with stone, or if it is, it's just very thin sheets, but it's mostly wood. And you can go right up in here and you can see the original woodwork of it. It's
On the inside?
you can look up in the inside.
Burned down yet?
No, it hasn't. It's still the tallest cathedral spire in England today. So from the very top, it's still the very tallest. Yeah, because it's protected by the cladding on the outside. Yeah.
Is the tower itself where the cross is, like where the center of the cross? Like you know how the
Yeah, the transept and nave. Yep.
Is the spire where the wood starts or the?
Yeah, right up here.
That's what the.
So there is really thin stone cladding here, but the interior of it, most of it is all built with wood. So that's why they're able to do it tall. We have this interesting innovation that's going to start here with Salisbury Cathedral, and other cathedrals are going to start to adopt it a little bit later on as well. We have what's called the double transept. And again, this is just an English innovation at this point, and then it's going to move on. This is where the tower is, by the way. And again, it's just more of that horizontal style, right? It's not going to be as very tall and thin as some of the other cathedrals we've seen. As we move inside, we see this.
Mirror table?
No, actually, it's a baptismal font. You can see the.
Oh, is it water?
This is much later on. This was a sculpture that was brought in later on as a holy water font as you're walking in. But you can see the little.
That's a holy water.
It's pouring out a little bit. So there's a little pump, and you can just go in and dip your hand in.
Is that a place?
Easter
It's
Vigil, the amount of water they?
Yeah, I know.
That are full of things.
But we do see here this gray marble and then the gray limestone. So darker gray marble, lighter gray limestone. We start to see kind of this development of we're going to decorate with stone. Not a lot of painting. We haven't seen a lot of painting. We haven't seen a lot of frescoes, right? And it's not going to be happening as much in English architecture. They're going to use paint on wood. We'll see that a little bit later, especially on the ceilings. But in terms of decoration throughout, it's just not much. The decoration is going to be mostly carved. Yeah.
They purposely do that with the dark gray and then the light gray because they know that it draws your eyes.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly why they did it.
Altars on the side?
Yes, or tombs.
Yeah, too.
I think they're tombs. The cathedral is a huge complex. It's actually has the largest cloister and it is the largest cathedral close. A close is basically the land, right? The land that surrounds. No, not a moat, but it's just the land that surrounds it.
It's nice just to walk
Um,
around the
yeah.
green.
So this was a parish church, but it also housed a community of monks.
Soccer over there.
but it also housed a community of monks, and so we see, again, this cloister here, right? And you can still go visit it, etc. So it's the largest cloister, the largest close, the largest land area. A lot of it was used for farming. Some of it was used for markets, right? The cathedral was kind of the center of life in medieval Europe and England. All right, let's look at decorated Gothic.
Okay, this isn't making sense.
Dec-
I don't get how they do this.
Does
Like,
the
this
sun
doesn't
ever
make any
shine
sense.
over there?
Very little. It's very cloudy.
That's why they're all
How do they
super
build
white.
something like this?
All right, decorated Gothic architecture. It's really going to be characterized by its window tracery. And it's called decorated because they're going to take the characteristics of English Gothic architecture and then they're just going to really expand on it and make it more decorative. So the tracery is going to get more complex, right? Instead of just these geometric shapes, we're going to start to have patterns that are going to start to develop in the tracery.
Mr. Latham, where do you get the money for these things?
It was just a lot of people working over a couple hundred years for each one. We're also going to see,
What's the eagle?
so you can,
Like a side altar?
the eagle. Oh, I'm not sure.
Probably say Mark.
Okay, where's the eagle? Where's
Oh,
the
I think it's a pulpit.
Oh.
There's just a thing behind it. So this is just a side chapel in Chichester Cathedral. But you can see that tracery that's in the windows. But we're also going to start to see a develop of more elaborate, more decorative vaulting as well. So vaulting.
Okay.
Wells Cathedral Choir. We're going to look at Wells. So Wells we already saw, right? Wells was early Gothic.
That's
But-
just the choir?
So the choir, this is the right in front of the altar, right?
Where do the people sit?
That is just so
They're behind. So the altar's up here.
Imagine getting married in there.
So the vaulting, so even though this is early Gothic, they're going to be adding in a lot more decorative vaulting later during the decorative period. So this is a good example of that, decorative vaulting up on the top. Some of it is structural, some of it is just decorative. As we move forward, we're going to see the Wells Chapter House, right? So this is the meeting house of the monks, right? Every day they'd come in for a meeting. Now it's kind of turned into an art gallery. But we see this development of this vaulting. We're going to talk more about this specific tile of vaulting a little bit later on. But you see
So it used to be a chapter house.
it used to be a chapter
What are
house.
the grates on the windows for?
It's really expensive and difficult to produce large panes of glass during this time. And so they're doing it in smaller and then just leading it with,
It's like how stained glass windows made.
yeah, because it's a lot easier to do it that way. All right, so let's look at York Minster. This is in the town of York, the Cathedral Church of St. Peter.
Is that the royal family is?
No, we'll look at that one. That's Westminster Abbey.
Oh my.
Very wide decorated Gothic nave and chapter house. This is kind of one of those cathedrals that has all sorts of different styles in it, but it's all sorts of different Gothic styles.
What's the design?
It almost looks blurry because
So this is called the Five Sisters. These are these 5 massive lancet windows. These are huge. This is part of the north transept. And again, unlike what we've seen in French and German Gothic, this one doesn't have any decoration, right? So a lot of the stained glass windows that we're going to see in English Gothic, again, with some exceptions, are going to be just purely geometric forms and decorations. These are huge. Each one of these is 50 feet tall. So 10 feet taller than the tower of the school, each one of these. So from the base of our school to the tower goes about here. And then it goes about another 10 feet.
This is inside the cathedral.
This is inside the cathedral in the north transept. As we zoom in, you can see it's this more gray, it's called grisaille glass. It has some color in it, but it's mostly just geometric patterns. We're not going to see any narrative scenes. We're not going to see lives of the saints or anything like that.
This long scaffolding,
what's
okay.
that pole thing hanging down from it?
What's that?
What's the pole thing hanging down?
I'm not sure what that is.
It's like a jumping thing.
No, I don't know what it is.
The fire escape.
It's so
No,
weird.
it's the bell ringer.
It's so weird how you have these beautiful churches and then they just have chairs for pews.
Yeah, but they didn't have pews.
Like it's just weird.
They didn't have pews.
But they didn't think to get
Yeah.
I don't know, nice pews. For
The nave on this one is a lot wider, right? So again, this horizontal stretch of these cathedrals. The nave is a lot wider. also decorated style. It's the widest Gothic nave in England, and it has a wooden Gothic roof. So actually, that whole roof is wooden, but is painted to look like stone, and then the vaulting is also wood, right? So the piers going up to here are stone, and then they're going to continue it with wood, again, to make it a little lighter. Yeah.
What's the overhang thing on the right?
Not sure. I couldn't find any information about
It's
that.
a hammock, or it's called
It's a hammock.
hammock.
Is that a
Oh.
pulpit?
No, this is the organ, and then this is similar to what we saw in Chartres, right? That screen around the altar, so that people can go around the outside. But again, York Minster is absolutely massive. Westminster Abbey, another great example of decorated English Gothic. Church got its first building in the 1060s under Edward the Confessor. He's kind of seen as maybe one of the first main English kings. He's still buried inside. But we have the consecration of the present church began in 1245 under the orders of Henry III. So the original church is here in the red, and then the 1245 church was basically built on top. So that way they're going to be able to start to build around it, and then they're going to start to build on top of it, and then eventually discard the internal church and continue to build. That way Mass and services can continue to go on. But you can see the development of the decorated Gothic, and then later on, the perpendicular Gothic, with all of this vaulting, right? We're going to see all this vaulting a little bit later on.
So they built red church, and then they started the blue church while there were people were in there.
In some places. So there would be little chapels where people could still, right, tiny little chapels where people could attend Mass. But it's built roughly on the same place. Westminster Abbey originally didn't have any towers. This is a drawing of what it originally looked like for many years. But then later on, they added on these towers up to the top. But even still, it doesn't have that really tall, spindly spire. Kind of sad, the monastery that was part of it, so it's called Westminster Abbey. It's where an abbot lived. It was a monastery. But if you remember, during the reign of Elizabeth I, the monastery was completely dissolved. Sorry, under Henry VIII, all the monasteries were disbanded. So you couldn't be a monk. You couldn't have monasteries. There were no abbots, anything like that. But in 1559, the church was made what's called a royal peculiar, or a Church of England church responsible directly to the sovereign by Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth I said, yeah, but it's still going to be a church. It's still going to be important, and it's going to be directly under my patronage. Why? Well, because of who started building it. We have Edward the Confessor, who's still buried inside. We have Henry III, very, very important king in English tradition. So Elizabeth I doesn't care about the religiosity of the church, doesn't really care about the abbot, doesn't care about the monastery, but she's like, well, this is important to me politically. There's other kings buried here. I'm going to make it my church, right? So it's a little bit of a sarcastic way of going about it.
Was Elizabeth the one that was persecuting people?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she didn't care really, but she still politically went after them.
Uh-huh.
Oh, jeez.
Yep. So the current Westminster Abbey is based on French Gothic styles. We see a lot of the same characteristics of Rheims. This one is actually a lot taller, a lot narrower than some of the other ones. It's more based on this French and German style compared to a lot of the other English Gothic styles. A lot more narrow. It's a lot narrower, but it still has these English Gothic characteristics, right? This very decorative vaulting. This is the tomb of Edward the Confessor. When the current cathedral was being rebuilt in 1245, remember Edward the Confessor was buried here in 1066. They removed his tomb so that they could rebury him in another place, and he was found to be incorrupt. So they canonized him as a saint. Again, this is 1200s. This is while England was still Catholic. But this is the tomb of Edward the Confessor, and so that's why it's still a very important place for English monarchs still today. The throne that all monarchs, or most monarchs, are crowned on, this is here in the cathedral. This is a wooden throne. It was Edward the Confessor was actually crowned on it, and so most every monarch has been crowned on it as well. Interestingly, this wooden seat here didn't exist, and you'll notice there's a space here. When England came and took over the Scots had what was called the scone stone. I don't think it has anything to do with the actual food scone, but that's what they called it, the scone stone. And this was the stone that every Scottish king sat on when he was being crowned. So England goes up, they raid Scotland, They say, well, now we're your king. And they're like, nope, you didn't sit on the stone. England said, hold my mead, watch this. They took the stone, brought it back to London. And then they said, ha, I'm going to be crowned king of England, and I'm sitting on the scone stone. That means I'm the king of Scotland as well. And so throughout history, the scone stone has been set inside here. You'll notice it's gone. Elizabeth, she just died, second. Elizabeth II returned it back to Scotland as a gesture of goodwill. So that's why there's that space there. But you can see when Elizabeth I was being, during her coronation ceremony, this is in the 1950s, you can see this same throne here, right? They moved it out of storage and they put it here. The scone stone, you can still see that little gray, that's still in there, but she returned it later. Westminster Abbey is hugely important for the monarchy. We have coronations being taken place here. King Charles, when he is officially crowned, I think later on this year, will probably be crowned in Westminster Abbey. He will probably be crowned on this chair. So if you watch news events of it or see pictures, look out for that throne. He's probably going to use that. He's not. He's officially the king, but he hasn't been.
How come? How come it's so long?
Because it's a larger ceremony. The moment his mother died, he was king. So it's an automatic thing, but then the official coronation takes place a little bit later on.
Why do they all dress in like the robe thing then?
Again, very, very old school way. These are all Anglican clerics, and then these are government ministers.
Tradition is our tradition.
You've seen Westminster Abbey before, even if you don't think you have. If you've seen anything about William and Kate, their wedding was here.
Can I get married there?
Yeah, maybe not.
Okay, there's Elizabeth.
I do love how they kind of decorated, though. They brought in live trees, kind of
That is
cool.
so cool.
It is really pretty.
What's behind
You
so
could
the
play
altar
checkers.
and like the huge?
Yep. So
What's
this is
behind that?
this is the altar, and then this is the screen, and then behind here, that's where the throne of Edward the Confessor is, or the.
Oh.
Are you allowed to pay to get right there?
I don't think so.
So the people don't get to see the coronation, only the people back there.
Right. So yeah. So people here, and then it continues on all the way down here. It's not that big of a church, but it is hugely important to the Anglican Church, and it's even more important to the monarchy. Right. All right. We didn't get to perpendicular. We'll continue that a little bit later.
So all the women wear hats. Like every woman we see. Do
Yep.
you have to wear a hat, or can you wear nothing? Like
Yeah. So in the Anglican Church, you don't have to veil or have your head covered as a woman, but it's just a tradition.
Probably a sign of like.
what's up there? That in the top left corner, you can see like a person up in the window, top left.
Top left.
Up,
Top
up.
left. Corner.
Right there.
Oh, probably a photographer.